Welcome back, time travelers, to another video. This one is on the Cold War. Now, the Cold War wasn't a war in the traditional sense. No grand battles were fought, no sweeping declarations of war were made. Yet for nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense geopolitical and ideological struggle for global supremacy that cast a long shadow over the entire world. This period, lasting from roughly 1947 to 1991, was a time of suspicion, proxy wars, and a terrifying nuclear arms race. The roots of the Cold War lay in the aftermath of World War II following the Allies' victory, or the Big Five, that is, the US, UK, France, China, and Soviet Union over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945. The wartime alliance between the democratic US and the communist Soviet Union crumbled as their differing ideologies clashed. The US, led by the principles of democracy and capitalism, feared the spread of communism, a system where the state controls the economy and property is held in common. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, believed communism was the superior system and viewed the U.S. as a threat to their way of life. This ideological divide manifested itself in a number of ways. Europe became a battleground of influence, with the U.S. implementing the Marshall Plan to rebuild war-torn Western Europe and the Soviets establishing communist satellite states in Eastern Europe. The Truman Doctrine, a U.S. foreign policy, pledged to support any nation threatened by communist takeover, setting the stage for numerous proxy wars, conflicts where superpowers indirectly fought each other through smaller nations. The Korean War, 1950-1953, and the Vietnam War, 1954-1975, were prime examples. The Western Bloc was led by the United States, as well as a number of first-world nations that were generally capitalist and liberal democratic, but tied to a network of often authoritarian third-world states, most of which were the European powers' former colonies. The Eastern Bloc was led by the Soviet Union and its Communist Party, which had an influence across the Second World and was also tied to a network of authoritarian states. The Soviet Union had a command economy and installed similarly communist regimes in its satellite states. United States involvement in regime change during the Cold War included support for anti-communist and right-wing dictatorships, governments, and uprisings across the world, while Soviet involvement in regime change included the funding of left-wing parties, wars of independence, revolutions, and dictatorships around the world. As nearly all the colonial states underwent decolonization and achieved independence in the period from 1945 to 1960, many became third-world battlefields in the Cold War. The most terrifying aspect of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union stockpiled increasingly destructive nuclear weapons, living under the constant threat of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and global annihilation when the Soviets secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast, to launch attacks against U.S. cities. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and a last-minute deal averted disaster. An agreement was eventually reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba, subject to United Nations verification, in exchange for a U.S. public declaration and agreement not to invade Cuba again. Beyond military confrontation, the Cold War permeated everyday life. Propaganda machines churned out messages demonizing the other side, fueling fear and suspicion. Espionage became a constant game, with both the U.S. and Soviet Union employing spies to steal secrets. With advanced technology, the U.S. and the USSR raised spying to an art form, James Bond style. The space race, a competition to achieve dominance in space exploration, became a symbolic battleground for technological superiority. Even sports became politicized, with victories used to showcase the supposed superiority of one system over the other. Despite the constant tension, there were periods of détente, or relaxation of hostilities. Leaders like U.S. President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev recognized the dangers of nuclear war and sought to establish communication channels. Arms control treaties were signed, and cultural exchanges, though limited, fostered a fragile sense of connection. The Cold War finally ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the birth of 15 newly independent nations. The reasons for this collapse were complex, but economic stagnation, political reforms, and rising nationalism in Eastern Europe all played a role. With the disappearance of its main adversary, the U.S. emerged as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War's legacy is still debated today. It was a period of fear, oppression, and missed opportunities, yet it also fostered technological advancements, spurred international cooperation on issues like nuclear proliferation, and ultimately led to the liberation of millions from communist rule. It serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of ideological extremism and the importance of diplomacy in a world with powerful nations. The Cold War may be over, but its lessons hold valuable insights for navigating the complex geopolitical landscape of today. With Russia calling America an enemy, are we heading into another Cold War era? Share your thoughts below and like, share, and subscribe, and for more on A Cuppa History.